Thank you, everyone, for coming. We're going to go ahead and get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Jerry Buckwalter. I'm not going to tell you all about him. I'm going to tell you why he's here. He's here because he inspired me. I saw him give a talk 6 or 7 years ago now. If you had asked me 10 years ago, was I excited about the future of civil or civil architectural and environmental engineering, I would have said no. Like, we kind of know what we're doing and everything's fixed by what the codes require and the way we've always done it in the past. And then I saw his talk, and it really got me thinking and looking and reading. And the more I did, the more excited I got about the future of our profession of civil architectural and environmental engineering, and of what we're going to do for society going forward and how important we are. So I really wanted to share that with you, and the best way to do that is to bring Jerry Buckwalter here. So Jerry, take it away and excite us.
Okay. Thank you. It's great to be here. I flew in yesterday from my house on the coast of Maine, quite a distance, which is where it's already, night before I left, was down to 43 degrees. So a different environment. I spend a few months every year up there. I'm normally a person that sits at the computer. I do analyses, I do forecasting, I do strategic assessments in technology and engineering disciplines. And going up there after the winter we had, I discovered the seawall that protects my house had been breached by the ocean, and I had to rebuild and build bigger a seawall, a riprap seawall, which I did by renting a bulldozer and excavator, and I did it myself over a 7-week period of time. Not what I was used to doing. But I actually got to pretend I was a civil engineer doing my own coastal rehabilitation project. Worse yet, after getting exhausted, I got COVID. Not the I feel mildly sick COVID, the down and out, running a fever, out of it COVID. And I thought, of course, the only thing I could think about is I hope I'm well enough to get to UT Austin. I was out of it, but my wife was getting worried. I did hear her talking to the doctor on my behalf, and the only phrase I remember is she said, "I don't know if he has a fever, but he was hot in bed last night." I felt better immediately. Let me jump into it. I'm here to talk about the future of engineering. I believe, after doing years of research for a variety of people, that there is a massive amount of change coming. I often say we're going to see more change in 50 to 100 years than we've seen in 1,000 years. I've been saying it so long, I actually believe it. And I do believe it. I think the evidence is there. In this case, it's going to cause either wonderful things to happen or huge dysfunction unless we're prepared for it. And this is just 6 representative trends that I think are particularly applicable to the built environment. To illustrate this, I'm going to use data from what was called the Future World Vision Project. And let me just describe what that was. I was at American Society of Civil Engineers at the time. I was the COO there, and we initiated this project. First of all, it's a classic scenario planning exercise, which is a great tool to use when you're trying to predict an uncertain future out a long period of time under great times of change. So first of all, we analyzed tons of global trends. So you open the aperture, you really check everything, not just the technology, not just the engineering. You see what society is going to be like and what the quality of life is. That should drive what we do in engineering, not just what we can do because we can do it. From there, we built scenarios. We looked at them over a long period of time, both the trends, what's driving the trends, what's the uncertainty factors with it, and what's the likely outcomes. And then we mixed those outcomes to build scenarios, and you're going to see those in a minute, all with the purpose of not just doing it for an academic exercise, but to drive what the resulting needs and realities of the future built environment would be. Therefore, from that, what the engineering roles and or partnerships should be, and what's the capabilities and skill sets that we will need. We then map those, because they happen at different points in time, or they come into maturity at different points in time. So we kind of looked at that, we segmented them, some are universal, and so we kind of did that kind of a play. Now this is a 300-page document, I'm just picking a sample. I'm now going to show kind of the purpose we did this, and I'm going to start with an old video that was made at the beginning of the process, which was actually featuring floating cities, one of our scenarios, from the early days.
Autonomous vehicles, climate change, new materials, high-tech construction, new policies, those things are all converging in the world of tomorrow. To take a look out 50 years is not typical. But we felt with so many changes, we had to free ourselves from today's constraints and take a step out that far. We're here to create a professional tool rooted in a future that's highly plausible because we're doing deep research with renowned experts in their field. Because 60% of the world's population live in coastal areas, we're starting with the floating city.
When we did the work on the mobile offshore base, we had a system which is 7 times an aircraft carrier. If you get very heavy weather, it will tear it apart.
They are now actively looking at putting large arrays of solar floating in space and using microwave to bring the power back to Earth.
At night, that solar-powered array will lower the kelp to a place where there's more nutrients. Sun comes up in the morning and they can grow. Once this gets going, it's almost an unlimited amount of biomass that could be used as a source of human food.
The master plan of today will be a kind of DJ that will be there for 15, 20, 30 years, constantly tuning to make the optimum atmosphere for the people in that city.
It's also very, very important to do this in a way that is respectful of the context that it's in.
Engineers have built nations over thousands of years. Now we will need to become masters at systems integration. In this virtual world, users will engage the analytical tools of today on the world of tomorrow. This is going to be a very exciting ride.
Just a taste of the drivers as to what we're trying to accomplish, the way we're doing it. This is my money slide, I call it. It's the most boring slide up there. But when you look at all the different scenarios and you find a common element that has to be done, no matter whether you're looking at one extreme or another, any scenario of the future, 50 years from now, requires what I call these engineering transformational imperatives. Those who were with me this morning heard me actually list some of these. Resilience in both extreme environments and huge demographic changes. Incorporate advances in all sorts of technologies. Embrace the digital world in all its variations. And understand system dynamics and the natures of system integration. It's a complex world, it's complex problems. We're going to need to get better at all of those. And so the future of engineering to me is doing the specialties we do now, we don't abandon those, but getting better at these kinds of things. Now, in addition to doing the analysis, which I've done over the course of my career, I've done these kinds of exercises mostly for the military and intelligence communities, which means they all get classified and no one ever sees them. This was for public use. So in addition to doing the analysis, in order to reach a large group of people, I felt we needed to turn it into a visual message We used a standard gaming engine to create a pseudo game where you could tour some of these future cities. The only one that's completely done is the mega city, but these, you saw a clip of this in the video. These are the 5 that we researched. I showed you a little bit of the concepts of Floating City, but the one that's fully complete and available to download, anybody can use it, it's free, is the mega city, a projected city of the future with over 50 million people in it, highly vertical, lots of personalization, all sorts of things, and you'll see a little bit more on that. We also mapped those elements of innovation, some elements of speculation, et cetera, but that's kind of what the project became, very different worlds. Now, I'm going to show you a video of the megacity, and again, this is a holistic view of a highly dense city. Again, the focus of this project was not to design or give you a design aid. You have all the tools you need to do that. You're learning that. This is to make sure you're asking the right questions for humankind. What's the quality of life? What's the societal benefit? How does the security and welfare of the world look like in this thing? That should help drive us to ask the right questions, and then we go about designing as we always do. We also use some traditional and non-traditional infrastructure, and it mostly has an aspirational orientation. In other words, I didn't want to show this. I wasn't in the movie making business where you always make a movie about how robots take over the world and, you know, kill everybody. I mean, that's the stuff of Hollywood. This is showing what we'd like to happen. But because we always learn from our failures, if you use that, I'm going to give a prize of some sort. I don't know what it is yet. If somebody can find a small element I buried in here that shows a huge dysfunction, I'm waiting for the first call for somebody to tell me they found it. But that's what you're going to see here, and it features the kinds of features you would expect from a highly dense city. A lot of roof features, things like that. However, there were 2 overarching themes that did kind of converge as we did this. One was, it's a resilient digital world. The benefits of being digital are so ubiquitous, it's never going away. We're never going back to analog for most things. It's here to stay. And it really is built on ethical circular economies. I'm not going to use the word sustainable or anything like that. No, I'm talking a general circular economies. We rehabilitate, we reuse, we renew, we do all those things. That will all be a part of it. And with that, I'll let them run this video.
If you don't make a plan or make a goal and have a vision, then you just react your way into the future. And that's not what we want to do as civil engineers. We want to lead into the future.
How we do our jobs as civil engineers, maybe as systems engineers, will be different in the future.
What are the different cities we see evolving, and how can we really get an understanding of those cities? How can we immerse ourselves in those cities today?
What are the different social infrastructures, physical infrastructures that can be created in which we can all come together and thrive?
What's really important about looking at this through a world-building lens is that it is designed to look forward and then thread back into the present. The further out you look, the more it changes our view of the present.
We're literally forced to not only reimagine our communities, but to rediscover our neighbors, to rediscover many of the things that are right in front of us.
We're spatializing narrative and allowing the user to tell their own story as they navigate the experience of this virtual cityscape.
What can a megacity grow toward so that it's serving a better purpose? You start looking at individual buildings then, because you can typically shape a building. And can you connect several buildings together?
The buildings might form coalitions and interact with the utility, and the utility will interact with the providers of energy all around. That becomes a transactive energy system, and the buildings can play an active role.
I can design a microgrid that serves that district. Or if we need the microgrid to serve an adjacent district, we layer those together.
We need a water supply system that can meet 15 million people's needs.
Every building in the future should be capturing sunlight and rainwater, and every building should be recycling its own waste.
Ideally, the life cycle of infrastructure is one that is continuous or perhaps reused in the future without going back and re-emitting all that carbon to do the same thing over again. That's the way we've built over the last century, and we simply cannot do it anymore.
Buildings are not unlike a human body. They have bones and skin. They consume energy and regulate temperature and generate waste. What if architects use genetic tools from synthetic biology to encode the architecture of buildings right into the DNA of organisms?
The facades now become active components. And one active thing that facades can do, they can breathe or they can sweat.
You can infuse biological functionalities into structural building materials.
Almost 100% of all the controls in buildings are going to have some element of AI in them and machine learning. As you walk into the building in the morning, the building will recognize you by your electronic signature. You would have created a profile about your temperature, your ventilation preference, and then some of this microenvironment might follow you.
What would social cohesion look like in the city of 2070? It's reasonable to expect that it would actually be vertical.
So, going vertically also brings its own challenges in terms of safety and security.
You might have 175 drones coming in at 11:45 a.m. delivering lunch. Where do they land? How much space are between them? What are the specifications?
It just has to be designed in a way that people can interact, and making sure that you're encouraging paths of travel that are spontaneous.
We're at just the right point in time to get together and build basically the aerial equivalent of what we did in this country with the National Interstate Highway System, and no longer be restricted to 2 dimensions.
So how do you get the public involved in civil engineering, in the process of civil engineering?
One of the best ways that we can make sure that all voices are heard and included is to start with the people who are doing the planning and developing and see what their teams look like.
How can you ensure social equity and social justice and get input from the community for the projects that we're working on?
We are very conscious about the demographic, the diversity of the community and the society, and make sure that we don't leave anybody behind.
Creating these multi-use spaces is one way of doing that, of bringing people together. And once they're in the same shared space, there is more opportunity for connection, there's more opportunity for shared experience, there's more opportunity for civil dialogue.
The best solutions on Earth, they come with diversity of thought. What I love most about the Future World Vision Project is that we can think about it together. We can have this dialogue.
Users will encounter one another and have conversations across disciplines that will begin to feed back and bring new information into the system.
We're trying to build a world and trying to build a machine that is creating absolute engagement of the user and of the engineer in their own future.
The Future World Vision is really at the core of what we're trying to do at ASCE in transforming the idea of what a civil engineer can be. And that's how we think that we can advance the profession of civil engineering and attract the best and brightest.
Oh my goodness, this 4th Industrial Revolution, married to the fundamentals of concrete, glass, and steel, is this incredible toolbox for society. It's really on us as civil engineers to pull that all together.
That's a snapshot of Megacity. In a related kind of vignette, I pulled these slides in 2 days ago. It's not a formal ASCE program, but we've worked out a deal with NASA, and I get to be a consultant on that project. And I picked 2 slides because they're essentially trying to help us do our off-planet city for us. In this case, using real NASA data to describe what the first habitation and community on the south pole of the moon would look like. Initially, we looked, when we did the off-planet research, on all of these kinds of things and postulated what would be needed. And now this synthetic moon project, it's called, is being done by DARPA for NASA, And it's about how to facilitate a lunar economy or a space economy. It's a cooperative initiative, and fortunately I get to represent ASCE on it, and we're actually involved with a studio in California who is also part of the exercise. This is the features. It's really, it's the next step forward. We did the megacity in a gaming engine, Unity. This one's being done in Unreal. It's a similar gaming engine. But in addition, we've added an omniverse, a metaverse package to it, so that it can be used and have input from everyone. So it's really a step forward in the virtual tools using government money to explore this from a civil engineering standpoint. It looks at all those things. Those are some of the things that were done in the first phase. We're already in phase 2 of the project. I show it because, again, civil engineering of the future will be lots more of the stuff we do now, but it will be also, some of you will be in lots of stuff involved in stuff like this, or floating, or a city in the Arctic, or whatever. The world's going to change. Now, it's kind of a sampling. I mentioned at the very first slide, I used the phrase provoke, think, act. It's my motto when it comes to planning for the future. Lots of us do lots of research, but then rarely provoke ourselves to think out of the box. This was designed to provoke us. On the other hand, if you just provoke yourself, but you don't do the research, that's just creating science fiction. So we're trying to blend those two. As a strategic planner, I also insist you got to figure out a way to take action. Otherwise, it's just been a nice exercise. So what's the first steps to taking action? And so I wanted to touch base on that and all the nuances associated with that. So I picked a current topic. Worldwide, you hear a lot about net zero carbon emissions. It's a huge project. It's a huge goal. And I would suggest, showing you a few slides only, that while it's a wonderful aspiration, we actually don't have much of a strategy for it. For instance, here's some good news. We have a lot of companies who've set a goal. Europe is well ahead of everyone else. The bad news, stuff that people don't think about. Getting to net zero requires 6 times the currently mined minerals on planet Earth. That's a lot of new mines. It will cost an unbelievable amount of money. And 3 countries control 75% of the output of all the minerals we need for a classic net carbon zero. Those have to be considered, otherwise you don't actually have a strategy to get there. Also, are we considering the unintended consequences? For instance, I just picked 2 ideas. I looked at solar panels, solar energy is a big one. And one of the things that I hear is we've got to ramp up. Well, we have. It's a 60% increase from 2016 to 2021 on solar panel installations, but the other rhetoric I hear is it's going to create lots of new jobs. Reality shows that it doesn't. There's actually been a net decrease of jobs in the solar industry by 11%, just like there's a net decrease in jobs in the classic coal and oil and natural gas industry. That's just kind of the dominant labor phenomena, and this is no exception to it. Doesn't mean it's not a good thing to do, it's just that that's a false claim. The other thing I use as an example was the recent 2022 legislation, which increased the funding for renewable fuels. In particular, it included ethanol and methane, which of course is funded by the corn subsidies in the Midwest and is absolutely polluting all the water in the Midwest. Those things are consequences that you didn't intend that should be considered if you're really going to develop a strategy and take action for things. Doesn't make the objective bad. I also mention this just for fun. These things become lofty governmental country goals. If you really believe in that goal, what's the part you're doing? It should affect what you're doing. I'm not saying you have to do all this, but you would be virtual a lot more. I love the third one. Those of us on email, you know the habit when you get an email and you just send an email back that says thank you? If every person in the world sent one less thank you email per day, it'd be the equivalent of taking 3,334 cars off the road. If you look at the total net combined energy consumption through the system. We rarely think about those things. I'm just saying, you don't have to do it, but you have to consider what your personal part is. I also talked about driving. What's the actual things? I used some examples. I love this one too. The last one. Streaming one movie per day requires more electricity annually than the yearly output of a new refrigerator for 21 homes for people who don't have refrigeration. That's an interesting trade-off. Again, I'm not suggesting these, I'm just saying there's a personal part. If you really believe in a goal, then you should be thinking through all of these things. Now, the real stats show that it's not actually working yet, which means we ought to re-examine the goal. It doesn't mean it's a bad goal, it just means we don't really have a strategy to get there. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is the role of innovation. One of my favorite topics, because when you talk about the future, there's lots of innovations that will be involved. Innovation is a good proxy for innovation is inventions. If you think about all of history, somebody raise your hand. What's the best invention you think was most impactful in a global scale on history? What's some of the biggest one? Right here. Agriculture, farming, plows, etc. That's a good one. Who else? Come on, got to have an opinion. Go ahead. Electricity, generating electricity. Writing, pen, writing, well, that would be a pen, but writing instruments, the development of language in written form. Go ahead. Pharmaceuticals, penicillin's a big one. Antibiotics. One more. Cars? Okay. It's in our DNA. I took a look back. I always thought that the wheel and sails were the first one, or the loom. Concrete goes even further back. And it kind of went along here, ancient times, up through when we started writing. Then it started to ramp up about 1000 BC. You got the agriculture, the plow, aqueducts. Of course, we invented gunpowder because we got to kill people more efficiently, things like that. And then it just took off. On balance, one of the things about innovation is you want to look at the net outcome, the outcomes of what you're inventing, or the innovation. It's all about the outcomes, not just innovating for innovation's sake. My favorite, believe it or not, is a strange one. It's the toilet. To this day, it saves the lives of that many people per year, every year, in areas of the world that don't have it as it gets added. Let's see, what do I want, a toilet or the internet? I think I'll take the toilet. Now, there's a lot of myths. We have this idea of the classic light bulb moment, those kinds of things. It's mostly myth. We are wired to be innovative, whether you believe it or not. History shows it. However, one of the biggest contributions is the way things connect. It's the old connect the dot mantra. That's the way it happens in your brain. Something's different that your brain's exposed to. It's a previous thought. It doesn't match. Your neurons actually rewire. They follow a new path. And a new idea emerges. Here's another one. This is a picture of the Grand Cafe in Oxford, England, one of the first coffee houses in the world. Now, keep in mind, this is Europe. This is late 1500s, early 1600s. Europeans drank gin for lunch, breakfast, dinner. Why? The water wasn't safe to drink. They were effectively drunk all day. Some of you may know that better than others. And then the coffee house came. Now, This is at the same time the Enlightenment and the Renaissance starts to take and spark. What happened? Well, maybe they just were on coffee and tea and they're more alert than when they were drinking gin, but I would suggest this is the first time we saw society in clumps where people from all walks of life, all trades, met, discussed, had conversations, and that mosaic of thinking began to happen. That is so important. I'll tell you a quick story. I'm probably going to run out of time, but that's how Future World Vision got started. In 2016, I had outlined this concept of this analysis for future planning. I was in Glendale, California. I was having a celebration from ASCE's innovation contest with some of the winners. We were looking at that analysis, and a gentleman whose name, at his request I don't share, who used to be the former head of science and technology at the CIA, was there with me. He's a good friend. I've talked with him for years. And he said, Jerry, you and I have been analyzing global trends and their impact on national sovereignty and safety for us and our allies for years. But these trends indicate a tsunami of change for the built environment. That's not the domain of the government or the military. That's the civil world. Civil engineers, environmental engineers, architects need to understand this because their world's going to change and they're really not thinking about it. I was chatting with him. I said, you're right. Then the head of Disney Imagineering was there. And he said, Jerry, I get it, but you got to tell a story. Because otherwise it's just an analysis. You got to create a narrative. You got to create something that compels people to search and investigate and internalize whether they believe this is true or not. That was where the idea for Future World Vision was born. A classic example of that coffee house experience, the connecting. I'm just an engineer, an aerospace engineer at the time. And so that's how those things happen. We don't have to go back to 1600. There is somebody who actually illustrates the same exact thought with this quote from Steve Jobs. You see all about connecting things. It generates creativity. It generates innovation. Now, I think there's actually a part. So this, those who are professors, just bear with me. This is for the students. There's a part you will all get to play, and this is about engineering. One, college is meant to be hard. There's no way to avoid it. Foster autonomy and resilience to tackle difficult challenge. Make sure you got a fail-safe way to have a community of people that support you, but don't shy away. Develop methods and tools to work through it. Two, make sure you're looking at a real version of life. Not the curated version other people want to see. Also, expect to fail. Embrace failing. You will learn fast from it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a good thing. Understand your career steps. The days of working for IBM your whole life are probably over. You'll never do that routine. Understand the change that will go. Lifelong learning, therefore, creates additional opportunities as you go through it, and you have to prepare for that. And lastly, earn the right to be heard. You'll get your voice, earn your respect to your colleagues, and then your voice will be heard to do the things that you're passionate about. Doesn't come immediately, but it comes. Now, everybody's career will be different. As you step out, it will just be so varied, and much of it you won't be able to anticipate. And I'll give you an example. This is a couple pictures from my journey. I grew up on a small farm in Pennsylvania, nothing, pretty poor family. Went off to New York City for college, was exposed to a whole new world that I had never known in my little isolated world. Sequenced through a whole host of things. 1982, I'm 27 years old. Yes, I really am that old. Tough to imagine. I was working as an electronics engineer for one of the laboratories for the U.S. Army, a civil servant. I wasn't military. And I traveled all over looking at electronic systems. I got a call one day and said, you got to go to San Diego. It'll be a working session, just dress casually. Okay, got it. I usually, don't book your flight, we'll take care of that for you. That was very odd. He said, we're going to pick you up in a helicopter and fly you down to Andrews Air Force Base. You're going to get on an Air Force SAC plane, and we'll take you. That's all I knew. I get on the plane. I'm in the jump seat with 5 other electronic engineers, some from the Navy, some from the Air Force. We didn't know each other. And we took off. I wasn't that bright back then, but I knew within half an hour we were not flying west. We were flying east. And I landed in the desert outside of Cairo. And they said, you guys get 2-3 hours of sleep. We have a captured Soviet tank out in the desert. We'll take you out to it. You're going to reverse engineer the missile guidance system on it so that we can develop countermeasures to keep our airmen safe. You're going to put it back together, and we're going to get it back into Soviet inventory before they know it's missing. Otherwise, they're going to change all the formulas on it. I didn't even know who these 2 guys were. I assume to this day they were CIA, but I didn't know. We did it. We flew home. You know, after all that passes, it's 3 days later. I walk to the house. Honey, I'm home from San Diego. And now that's a mind blower. I'm 27 years old. It embarked me on this whole different path. You never know. There, as an engineer, you are the problem solvers of society. You will be exposed to opportunities you have no clue yet are going to come your way. From there, I ended up doing massive work on port security systems later on after 9/11 for the whole nation of Italy. And then finally, you know, one of the privileges I had was being appointed to the President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council, and I actually got to brief both George W. Bush and Barack Obama on critical infrastructure protection policy issues. Who would have thought a guy who just took engineering would have that kind of a path? Just go with it. Put your head down, get your work done, do good work, and you'll be amazed at the opportunities that if you work through it will be exposed to you. That's part of the part you are going to play. Lastly, I wanted to challenge you. I always look at the audience and I get a third of the audience kind of numb, and I get a third kind of, yeah, this is going to happen. And I got a third that clearly they think I'm crazy and this isn't all going to happen. Be willing to accept that the future could be disruptive. And I've used this illustration. Bob remembers it from years ago. At the end of the 19th century, policymakers met in London from all over the world to look at a big problem. Manure was 3-4 inches deep in the streets of London and most cities around the world. This is a major problem. And if they did all the sensible projections, it was going to be knee deep. Now, obviously, now we look back, that didn't happen. Once the car appeared, not only were those forecasts wrong, they were ridiculous. I always like it because when this happened, the automobile was hailed as the environmental savior. We don't think of it that way today. But I hear a lot of that kind of skeptical thinking even today. But we have to figure out how those disruptions turn into a positive story, and we manage those, and we be prepared for those kind of disruptions. The other thing is don't be too resistant to adopting new things. This is a study, a classic study done a long time ago on the conversion of industry from steam power to electric power when electricity came along. You notice the adoption curve. I mean, it was a 30-year gap before the actual factories redesigned to handle these multiple smaller motors instead of some of the big steam engines. It didn't make sense. It was obviously better, more productive. They analyzed all the reasons for it. And you know what the number one conclusion was? They had to wait for the managers of the plant to die or retire. because they simply knew the old way and they weren't going to change. We're going to lag behind what we should be doing if we're too resistant to adoption of those changes. So I challenge that in your university days, you are the next agents of change. You really are. And you will learn some different skill sets than the previous generation, and you will get to work on wildly different things, some totally traditional if you want them to be, and some very non-traditional. And a good example of that I show with this. They actually, at ASCE, took my analysis in the mega city software platform, and they did an IMAX movie. And this is just a trailer they did early, but I do it because it describes the need for us as agents of change.
Glaciers are losing mass at an alarming pace.
Intensify significantly, as you can see
Wildfire
behind
is
me.
now
The
second largest in state history.
That actually was released to museums and science centers around the world on January of this year. Here's this museum closest to you where that has booked it already, should you choose to go see it. And again, this is more kind of inspirational and a PR message designed more for kind of high schoolers who might be to that science center, so they understand what engineers do, what they build, and what they will be doing in the future, which is going to be exciting. And that's it. I'll take some questions, but thank you for your patience and putting up with me. And I'm up for any challenge, about how crazy all this is. That's okay. Anybody? I know, y'all just want to get to the reception. Oh, we got some up here.
After your career of working with so many different types of engineers, what do you feel, if anything, that they tend to be lacking?
All engineering disciplines I've worked with almost all of them, from cyber to aerospace, space, civil, you name it. One, to our credit, we are the world's problem solvers. But sometimes we lack imagination because we're so focused on constrain the variables, solve the problem, and God help the world if we don't do that. But to anticipate what we need to be, we need a little more imagination. There's two things. That's the one. Universal, all engineers, because that's the way we're wired. Two, we've lost our systems integration muscles. If you go back 200 years ago, my grandfather and his grandfather were systems engineers just plowing the field. They had to think of everything it took to survive. We've become so specialized over 150 years, all for the good. Look at the advances in medicine and everything you can think of. But our system integration muscles atrophied. To solve tomorrow's complex problems, we have to think at a systems level. And engineers like to get focused. So the two common elements is we need to relearn systems integration, systems thinking, and two, if we're going to be prepared for the future, we have to get a little more, left brain, right brain equality going on to be a little more imaginative. That's the two common features across all engineering. Now, here's a point, while you get that there. If some of you want to just be the best next steel bridge builder or whatever, we're still going to need that. There's room for everyone. I'm here to try to help people understand that some of you will do the traditional, but some will get to work on radically different things. If you're up for it, there's a place for you. If you want the traditional, there will be a place for you as well.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. My question is, if you're familiar with direct air capture technologies, if you could comment on what you think the future of it is and its importance for not just reaching net zero, but also removing some of the things that we've already been putting into the atmosphere for so many years.
Well, I think it's perfectly applicable. It's perfectly valid. So carbon capture, absolutely, there is a place for that. As long as it's one of the tools within a balanced mix of mitigation and adaptation. The criticism of carbon capture is, okay, so you do that so you'll keep emitting and you don't have to make that change. That's a valid thing to think about. So we have to make an adaptation to what we emit, and greenhouse gases, carbon use, all of that. At the same time, we're at a stage where our natural evolution is already occurring. It's quite obvious, and we have to do adaptation, and carbon capture is a perfectly legitimate one among several that I think are great adaptation methodologies. Oh, got one down here.
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned earlier in the presentation the large amount of material and financial cost that goes into even just going to net zero for a bunch of these countries. How do we as engineers convince the public that these are necessary costs, and especially going into future projects like you mentioned earlier?
I think there's a couple things. And man, this one's hard. This one's really hard. We're talking about not just public perception, but governmental regulation and getting that to change. Man, you're talking a lot of headwind here. So a couple thoughts. None are perfect solutions. There is no perfect solution for this one. One, there are glimmers of recognition with some leaders around the world. And I don't mean those who just beat the drum on I mean sensible leaders who say, okay, what's it going to take and what's the impact of that? those champions have to be supported. We have to cue to them and help them be successful, and then other leaders follow. So there's a public relations, public affairs element, and guess what? Civil engineers suck at that. I mean, let's be real. There's lobbyists all over Washington for everything under the sun. Civil engineering is like a little mouse squeaking in a corner compared to some of these, okay? We have to get better at public affairs to influence that. 2, we have to not exaggerate. I may offend some of you here. Just don't invite me back, okay? As some would say, climate change is an existential issue. It is not an existential issue. Now, I may lose my home on the coast of Maine. I'd be a denier if that was the case. But I have to accept the fact that that doesn't change my existence, it changes where I live. You know, we say that because we don't want to give up, you know, our billion-dollar homes on the coastal properties. Come on, let's get real. We've survived this for hundreds of years. I just finished a tour down the Rhine River in Germany, and I could watch the water level markings on the towns. Over 1,000 years, they've hit high water marks that we haven't even begun to hit yet. So this, be sensible, be balanced, and I think accept the fact that you don't go to either extreme, and you try to make sensible changes. But I would suggest this as well, and this is where innovation comes in. I mentioned we have to do both mitigation and adaptation. There has to be a balance. We're kind of moving between those two right now. Globally, it's all a bit about mitigation. Stop using carbon. Stop emitting greenhouse gases, okay? Now we're finally starting to say, well, wait a minute. Some of this change is inevitable. We're already past the mark on some of them. We have to adapt. My next message for engineers is, that's why you have engineers. They're problem solvers. And that's why we have to be more innovative. Just because codes don't call for it, just because that's the way that's the accepted practice, we should develop greater strength in innovation to look at possible solutions to adapt and still have high quality of life even while the environment changes around it. But to me, that's no different than the changes we have to do for the population density we're going to have in the urban areas. Those changes are equally as tough, and we're going to have to innovate. So I think that's kind of the 3 things, but that one is so hard, which is why sometimes you might have to spend more on some immediate adaptation stuff, which people will appreciate and understand, before you get the money to do the mitigation stuff. So there's this balancing act, because that's a big global problem. Right here.
Thank you for your presentation. I have 3 things to say. With respect to the movie, I think it's a great idea, and I was telling my colleague that you should show it to high school students and middle school students. And when you said high school, I was like, yes, you're right on the money. But what I'm noticing in terms of like K-12 education, students are really forming sense of identity and career choices even younger than high school, right? So really looking at pushing it out to even middle school students would be a good idea. With respect to your comment about forecasting, I think it's a provocative statement that you made in terms of like, or maybe you didn't intend it or mean it this way, in terms of like ignoring like forecasts. I think it's important that we recognize the complexities and the assumptions that are made with forecasts, and even more so thinking about what happens if you don't make that change, right? So it's not that the forecast was necessarily incorrect with respect to the example that you showed in London, but something happened, right? So the forecast may have come true if that disruptive change didn't happen. So I think that's, you know, a little flip that I want to give on that statement. And the last thing is that you keep talking about innovation, and I definitely agree with it. What can our students do to foster or to develop this skill set of innovation? So what can they be doing right now? Even us as faculty members, what should we be doing to try to help our students strengthen their skills in innovation?
Okay, I'm going to comment on 3 in sequence. 1, you're absolutely right about the movie. hopefully ASCE will do the same thing they did when they did the Dream Big movie, I guess 6-7 years ago, and then after it had its Science Center run, back then, they bought a DVD. They made a DVD and sent it to every high school in the country and middle school in the country. Every single one got one. I'm hoping they do a similar outreach with this, because that's where it needs to go, because that's a lot more people than the amount that are going to go to the Science Center. So absolutely right. 2, you're absolutely right about I say it that way deliberately to be provocative. I often say, I didn't say it here, I say I do forecasting because they're always wrong. When in fact, it's partially true, but you make adjustments as you go because you see the changes, or you see the mediation, or you see a new innovation, and you adjust. Forecasting is about making those adjustments so that you're prepared. The reason forecasts are important is because if you didn't do it, you wouldn't even think about it. And then those adjustments catch you by surprise, or the worst thing happens because you didn't choose to do anything about it. So you're absolutely right. Now I got to remember the third one. Yes. I go back to one of the best ways for me, and I think in general, is this connecting the dot thought pattern. You should read, you should investigate examples of innovation and innovation. That's all good. But to me, the most important thing is rubbing elbows and having conversations with people from a dissimilar viewpoint, with people from a different discipline. I go back to my story about the beginning of Future World Vision. This is a former CIA, Disney, and an ASCE engineer. I often say it's this Future World Vision is what happens when you put an engineer with a mouse and a spy. It's like, but those are the uncommon combinations that create innovation. So a lot of people use connected dots. I describe it as mosaic thinking. You should have a circle of people that are in the humanities or other engineering disciplines or science, and you should create forums where you have time for some discussion over anything, and you'd be surprised how a different perspective on something that you all experience generates an idea in your head. I'm a big fan. I was a physics major, so I was all about physics. The reason I liked physics, because I wasn't as wired to solve the problem the way most engineers. I was wired to understand the phenomena. And that's why I became a strategic planner, because it was all about understanding all sorts of phenomena, which all work together to create the world we live in. And so the more you have conversations with people with different experiences, different disciplines, different training, I think your innovation muscles strengthen. Now, you also have to find then, in whatever company you go to or government agency or whatever, one hopefully that has an understanding of that and gives you a little freedom and a voice to look at that. As an example, they don't create all civil engineering companies alike. Some are just take the best, most profitable job and go get it done. And others are spending a little R&D to look at future stuff, and they encourage innovation. Find one that gives you that space to start to use those muscles with a little bit of your time. That's the way it starts. And I think I've used my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. We have a reception just outside for the next 30 minutes, so you all get a chance to ask more questions of Jerry. We really appreciate it. Thank you.